there you are, friend. Glad you're here. How was your journey? Alas, the forest is indeed a dark place these days. Well, now you can leave your troubles behind and take comfort by the fire. Is this your first time at the Aeolian? I see. So you've never tasted our warming meat pies or our delicious sugared fruits? You'd prefer a refreshing ale, I see. Well, we do have mulled wine as well. You'd like to try that too, as you wish. But first, I see you're carrying some heavy trunks there. Please, we'll have them taken up to a room for you. You are staying the night? Good. So, my friend, tell me, do you like stories? You do? Well, at the Aeolian, we're famed for our stories, and I heard a curious tale just the other day. Have you ever heard of the legend of how the moon and the sun first came into being? You'd like to hear the story? Of course you would. Come join me by the fire, have a sip of your drink, and allow me to guide you through the magical realms of the imagination. Close your eyes now, and picture this. In the beginning, there was a young and tender forest that hadn't learned to dream yet. At its center was a sacred spring, and in time, the bubbly waters that welled from it gave birth to a water baby, who, much like the forest, was born into a dreamless slumber. It wasn't too long before the spores of a great mushroom settled onto the water baby, and by virtue of their miraculous properties, these spores coaxed the liquid baby into its first dream. It was a dream of pine needles, of roots questing deep into the earth, of distant blue peaks where the wind whistles through cool, mossy caves. The liquid baby dreamt for eternities untold, flowing through the forest in its dream, till at last it came to a tall mountain that jutted into the mists far above the forest canopy. The liquid baby was curious, and so began to ascend this lofty mountain. For the first time, the liquid baby was afraid of the unknown, yet still curious. Its fear and its curiosity began to swirl inside it, first in one direction, then the other, until as it fought with itself, it began to separate into two distinct shapes, with two heads, two sets of arms and legs and feet and hands, until standing there was a young girl with silver braids and a young boy with golden locks. They were fascinated by each other, and the girl, who was brave and curious, took the boy by his hand and led him up the mountain. They ascended, fingers entwined, deeper into the mists until the air grew very thin and the mists cleared, giving way to a beautiful view. They saw distant lands that extended far beyond the edge of the forest, and just visible on the horizon was a sparkling lake. The girl was entranced by that sparkling lake, and in her dream, for she was still dreaming, she imagined all the adventures that could be hers, and hers alone, if she journeyed to that lake. The boy, however, who was also still dreaming, wished for nothing more than to love the beautiful girl by his side and to return to the forest with her and discover its secrets together. He was the first to speak. "Let us go into the woods and be merry," he said. And he looked so radiant that her heart was glad, and she took his hand again, and they ran back down the steep mountainside, the wind beating against their faces, until they reached the skirt of the mountain and re-entered the forest, singing and dancing, laughing and talking ceaselessly. Much time passed, and as it did, she came to love him too, and so the silver-braided girl forgot all about distant lands and sparkling lakes, for a while at least. They were very happy, in particular the boy, who delighted in the simple joys of forest life and the love and security bestowed on him by the presence of his silver-braided companion. And he grew to dislike any big changes, to dislike anything, in fact, that threatened to alter his perfect happiness beside his silver-braided girl. But she began to grow restless. She remembered that sparkling lake, which had called to her, whispering of wonders to be found beyond the forest. She spoke of her restlessness to her golden-locked companion, but he didn't want to listen. And he dismissed her and made her promise never to leave the forest, for the forest was their home. And because she loved him, she agreed to this. Yet her heart was heavy. In time, she found herself venturing alone from the sacred spring, until, eventually, her wanderings brought her to the edge of the forest, and before her stood wide-open grasslands, rippling hills, mountains, valleys, and in the far distance, the allure of the sparkling lake shimmering against the twilight. Each wave a tiny star inviting her to dance among them. Even so, she remembered her promise to her companion of the golden locks never to leave the forest, and she didn't want to upset him. Yet she thought, perhaps a quick wander into those grasses. I won't be long. I'll soon go back to him. So she closed her eyes and took her first step out of the forest and tasted a new freedom, feeling emotions she had never had before. Will the girl soon return to the forest as she said she would? She certainly intended to, but let me speak now of our golden-locked boy, who was at that very moment searching for his silver-braided love. He was calling to her, but there was no reply, and in time, a terrible fear began to well up inside him. Something was wrong, he knew. He'd searched for her in all their usual spots, the caves, the mountains, the riverbanks. He even listened intently to the wind, straining for a whisper from her soft lips. But she had truly vanished. The boy with the golden locks felt all alone and wept inconsolably. He wept for so long that his tears turned to blood, and the leaves of the forest were soaked red and began to die. And thus, autumn and winter touched the forest for the first time. The forest became an eerie place. He no longer felt safe there without the comfort of his beloved. He spent all his time by the sacred spring, consumed with sorrow, wasting away while he waited for her to return. Eventually, an idea came to him. Perhaps you are lost, my love, and can't find your way home. I will sing a song for you, a song of flowing waters, of deep roots and mossy caves, and of silver and golden light, and an everlasting spring. If the song reaches you, then it will guide you home again. And as he sang, the song was carried forth by the frothing waters of the spring and spread throughout the forest and beyond. But why didn't the girl return to the forest as she intended, you might ask? This is what happened. As she left the forest behind her and took her first steps into the land that lay beyond its edge, she awoke for the first time in her life from her long dream. You see, the forest wasn't your usual kind of forest. It was a forest of dreams, a timeless realm. And once the silver-braided girl left her forest and awoke, she began to forget her dream. And as she walked on, in wonder at this new feeling of wakefulness, the forest and the golden-locked boy and their sacred spring all faded from her mind. Not knowing who she was or where she was, she followed a fragrant breeze that led her into a great grassland with beautiful strange trees dotted about, and there in the distance a sparkling lake. She thought she knew that lake from somewhere, and so she ran towards it. At the edge of the lake, she dived into it, feeling alive and refreshed. She swam for a while, enjoying her freedom, and then returned to the sandy shore, where she sat a while thinking. until a sudden sadness and longing took hold of her heart. Something precious had been lost to her, and now all she could feel was a terrible heartache. She wept and wept, and where her desperate tears touched the sand, crystals of the most startling shape and colour were formed and began to overflow across the shore. She heard a voice whispering to her then. It was the lake. It had a desire to impart secret knowledge and comfort to her. Her tears ceased, and she listened carefully to every whisper as the lake taught her how to build a castle out of the crystals born from her tears. A castle that would keep her safe and her sadness at bay. An enchanted castle made of coloured crystals. News of this marvel travelled far until it reached the realms of women and men and children, and many came to dwell in the vicinity of this wondrous place. A great city emerged and thrived around the lake, the castle at its centre. There were markets, and there was music, and there were dances, and in the middle of it all was the silver-braided girl who had grown into a contented woman. The citizens loved her, and as long as she stayed near to the castle, her sadness was kept at bay. Yet, a time came when a wandering minstrel came to the city with a new song, which she happened to hear. The song bewitched her. It spoke of flowing waters, of deep roots and mossy caves, and of silver and golden light, and an everlasting spring. It sounded so familiar to her, yet she couldn't place it. When the minstrel had finished the song and the applause had ended, she called out to him and asked him if he had written the song himself. "Alas, no," he said. "I learned this song from a bird that lives on the edge of a great forest yonder." And he pointed into the distance. She was reluctant to leave the castle behind, but she was so taken by the song of the bird that she was determined to find it and learn its story. She set off in the direction the minstrel had pointed out to her, and before long she saw the great forest in the distance. As soon as she was there, she heard that bewitching song again, coming from a bird just ahead, a song of flowing waters, of deep roots and mossy caves, and of silver and golden light, and an everlasting spring. She exclaimed, "You're the bird I've been looking for. Did you write that song yourself?" "Alas, no," said the bird. "I learned this song from a magic river that flows backwards, uphill, until it reaches its source at the heart of the forest. This is a great portent the silver-braided woman thought to herself, and she entered the forest, which seemed very dark and foreboding. Eventually, she made her way to the river that flows backwards uphill, and she heard that bewitching song again, emanating from the river's frothing waters. She followed the song until she reached the spring on the hill at the heart of the dying forest. Something came over her then, a memory of a distant dream within a dream, another life she'd led once. Yet the memory was incomplete, something was missing, someone was missing from it. And then she saw him, through the trees, singing to himself, her golden-locked companion. His head was turned away from her, but she knew it was him, and now her memories came flooding back like an unstoppable waterfall. How could she have forgotten him and those wondrous days in the woods? She was at last back home, and she longed to exchange stories with him as they used to. But just as she was about to cry out to him and run over to him, he turned his head a little. He hadn't seen her yet. And she saw, to her shock, he was still a young boy who hadn't aged a day since she had last seen him. She suddenly realized that while she had lived a life, had changed, had grown, had been out in the world, he had remained in the timeless realm of the forest, and looking at his sad face and all the decay around her, she realized that she could not remain here where nothing grew, nothing changed. She turned and ran with tears in her eyes, sad to be leaving the golden-locked companion of her youth behind again. But she was clear in her purpose. She knew herself truly for the first time. She was a free spirit, destined to seek out new adventures, to roam, and to embrace change and transformation. As she ran, she began to glow inside her, and her skin became almost translucent as she rose into the air, turning into an orb of silvery light, making its way across the sky. Sometimes we see her silver hair glistening as she passes overhead, shining her light on weary travelers lost in the night. The boy heard a commotion through the trees and followed it, and saw a trail of silvery tears. He knew that his love had finally returned, and he was overjoyed. But where was she? He ran, following her trail of tears, which was slowly fading. His mind was in turmoil as he sprinted through the trees, and when the trail suddenly ended, he feared something awful had happened. His sense of trepidation and loss grew, and like a wild beast he ran now, not knowing which direction he took, desperate to find his beloved, until, unexpectedly, for the first time in his life, he reached the edge of the forest. There he stopped and saw in the sky, and moving away from him at speed, a silvery orb that he recognized at once as his true love. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. She was beautiful, just as he remembered. But she was transformed, no longer his. She had been in the vast world and become vast herself. She had left everything she knew and loved behind, and so had found her true self. As this notion grew inside him, he realized with a great pain that his world had remained small, and he would never see her again unless he too was willing to leave everything behind. Her silvery light was now descending in the distance, and he understood this was his last chance to follow her into the unknown he had always feared. Without looking back, he took a giant leap into the air, leaving the forest behind, and finally waking from his dream as he too ascended, becoming a golden orb of light, chasing his beloved through the sky, resolute in his faith that someday he would be reunited with her. And that's how the moon and the sun came into being. She, ever curious and the mother of change, and he, resolute in his love for her, following her into the unknown, shining Father of that which grows. They have not as yet been reunited, yet sometimes they cross paths in their endless journeys.